let me introduce, if I need to, Mike Chinoy. There's probably no one who's spoken here as many times over the last few years as Mike. We always enjoy it. His series on American foreign correspondents in China has been just terrific. As you know, he is a senior fellow at the U.S. China Institute at the University of Southern California. He is selling DVDs of his Tiananmen Square installment of this series, as well as the installment you're going to see tonight. They are DVDs that he burned on a computer, so they will work, or should work, absolutely will work on a computer, but not necessarily on a DVD player. They're designed, the DVDs at the front there are designed to be played on a computer. But if any of you want to get them, this is a project gathering information on foreign correspondence that has to encounter the hurdle that the networks charge an arm and a leg for every second of time that you try to buy from their archives for this kind of a documentary. And so he's selling those DVDs at the front partly to be able to get more seconds of network time for the future installments. With that, I'd like to introduce Mike, who will say just a couple words about the documentary, and then after the documentary is over, he'll take your questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Keith. I'm delighted to be back here. This film looks at the experience of American correspondents covering China in the 1970s. And so it has a special resonance for me because I began my career as a sort of fledgling China watcher showing up in Hong Kong in late 1975. So some of the events that are central to this film are events that I covered, and I have vivid memories of going with great trepidation to the old Foreign Correspondents Club over where the Hong Kong Club is now, and watching these legendary figures who I found extremely intimidating holding court at the bar telling war stories and so on. So it's very special for me to be able to come back here and share this with you. Let me ask, how many of you have seen other episodes of this series? Raise your hand. Okay, so most of you know what this is about. The 30-second soundbite version, for those of you for whom this is new, is that this is a multi-part series we're doing at the U.S. China Institute at the University of Southern California on the history of American journalists in China from the 1940s to the present day. Basically trying to tell the story of the people who have told the China story, because our feeling is that the way the U.S. press has covered China over many decades has been hugely important in shaping popular perceptions of China in the States and around the world, but most people don't have the slightest idea how the correspondents who did that job actually reported the country. What was involved, for example, in covering the death of Chairman Mao when you couldn't get into China to do it and you had to sit here, which is one of the issues that's explored in this film. So we began this process of tracking down old China hands from various quarters and collecting all this amazing old footage, and we're telling their story. We've got 7 of the planned 10 episodes done up to through Tiananmen Square. Eventually, we'll bring the story up to the present day. The episodes are also available on our website, china.usc.edu, and they're primarily designed for educational use in China education and China studies and journalism education programs in colleges and universities, but done in such a way as to be accessible to the public at large, which is to say people like yourselves. I don't know how many, are there anybody who was in Hong Kong in the 1970s here? All right. Anybody who worked as a journalist in Hong Kong in the 1970s here? I guess I'm the only one. So, but anyway, one of the things that's interesting about this film is it's the evocation of Hong Kong and the experience of journalists at that time. So with that, why don't we turn the lights off? And the film lasts just under an hour, and that should leave us plenty of time for discussion afterwards.
Thank you. That was very interesting. With that, why don't I open up the floor to questions? I'm sure many of you have them. I've already had a chance to talk to Mike here at dinner. First of all, in the corner there, please.
Hi. Given your experience, your long experience in China, is Xi Jinping's recent, in your view, Xi Jinping's crackdown on corruption in China, is that truly a corruption or is it a purging, in your view?
But I guess when I went to North Korea some years ago, my producer at CNN, after we left, we'd made a number of visits. When we left, he turned to me and he said, well, I'm still confused, but at a higher level. So I have to preface anything I say with the fact that, we still don't know an enormous amount. And one of the ironies of what's happened in China over all these years is that while the country and the society are much more open and much, much more accessible, sort of machinations at the top of the kind that are documented here are still very, very opaque. So there's an awful lot we don't know. That being said, I think Xi Jinping is serious about trying to do something about corruption. I think he recognizes that corruption is a cancer that could threaten the Communist Party's grip on power and ability to run the country. It's also a very convenient tool to take down opponents. I think it's what's striking to me about the campaign is how risky it is, in a sense. I mean, he's really he's picked fights with an awful lot of people all at once. And I think he has tremendous popular support because people really hate corrupt, sleazy cadres, and to see them getting taken down is popular. But I don't know where this goes or how it ends. I don't know to what extent it's generated so much concern and anxiety and fear within the system. Keith and I were talking about this, the system might seize up to some degree if rich people are afraid to invest because they don't know whether they're going to be a target, and people are, so it's a very fraught period. And there was a piece, I think, in the South China Morning Post the other week in which Xi was quoted as saying this is a life and death struggle. And so the implication is that they're concerned about some kind of pushback. So it's a very high-risk move on his part, and we'll just have to see how it plays out. I don't know if that answers it, but there are just so many unknowns at this point.
Thank you. Next, please. Right here, please.
Thanks, Mark Michelson. Mike, Deng Xiaoping appears, and of course the focus was on the political side. But were there any indications? Maybe it's something you can do in retrospect a little bit, that there was anything being considered about economic reform during this time? Not obviously the program that we once saw, but were these issues front and center? Because China was obviously suffering, and I know it was in political turmoil, but were there any indications you can see looking back that maybe you could see as indicators of what might happen going forward?
Well, I mean, Deng was brought sort of back from political exile in '73, I think, and Zhou Enlai sort of tasked him with trying to stabilize the economy. He was in charge of the economy and foreign affairs. But you had this power struggle that essentially dominated the whole Chinese political landscape. I mean, the first time I went to China, which was in 1973, when I was still a student, there were all these posters. They were having a criticize Lin Biao, criticize Confucius, Pi Lin Pi Kung campaign that was launched by the radicals that was an indirect attack on Zhou Enlai and therefore on Deng Xiaoping. So you had this incredible sort of ideological pushback, which I think severely constrained Deng's ability to do anything. And then you basically had a whole year, '76, when nothing happened because the struggle was at its climax, and that just consumed China. So they did nothing on that score.
Next, please. Over in the corner, please.
It was a brilliant piece of journalism. I enjoyed it very much, and China made a huge progress since then. And I have a hypothetical question. With your experience in China, do you think we will see in our lifetime this type of documentaries being accessible in China? Do you think we will see Chinese government maturing enough and being self-confident enough to allow this documentary to be seen by Chinese public or Chinese students or Chinese academic community or whatever?
Well, I've shown this film in China.
Publicly or?
Yeah, university audiences. I guess the other way to phrase it is, could a film like this be shown on Chinese TV? And the answer is obviously not. But I think within the context of I've shown a number of these episodes that go up to the early 1980s in this series at Chinese universities. But it's very tricky, and small audiences, closed doors, not mass dissemination. The room has been greater. I haven't done it in the last year, so we'll see. But I just don't know. I mean, this is one of these, every time you predict something about China, you're wrong. I mean, if somebody in 1986 had predicted, when I moved to Beijing to open the CNN Bureau in '87, if somebody had predicted Tiananmen Square, I would have thought they were crazy. A week after Tiananmen Square, if somebody had predicted China today, I would have thought they were crazy. So I've just learned that I'm glad I don't have to embarrass myself in front of millions of people on TV anymore making these predictions, because it's always it's so hard. But I think, China's like a paradox, and I think this is one of the themes that I keep coming back to as I struggle trying to make sense of it. It's a place that, things happen that are diametrically opposed and contradictory at the same time. I mean, I would argue, even with the crackdown, that ordinary Chinese people have greater personal freedom now than at any time, maybe in the late 80s. But other than that, extraordinary personal freedom, but minimal, if non-existent, political freedom. It's a place where I can show this video, but a Nobel Prize winner goes to jail for writing a petition. And it all happens in the same place, and that's one of the things that's hard in getting your head around China, is there's just so many contradictory and paradoxical strands in society all at once. It makes it really hard to sort of figure out and to write about, I think, to cover.
We have one over here, and then Edith, please.
Mitch and you. It's a related question. To what extent, when you're in China now and you take maybe the average under 40-year-old, are they informed by that period? Are they aware of it, or are they even interested in that period?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's difficult to generalize. History is very problematic in China, and so they go back and forth about how much of what can be discussed about the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. You talk about people under 40. I mean, the generation over 40 lived through the Cultural Revolution. They are sort of hitting their prime now, and so they, for them, it's a more sort of vivid memory. Although it's, what lessons does one take away from that? I don't know. I mean, Xi Jinping is a good case in point. I mean, his family was victimized. I mean, his mother died. He was sent to the countryside. His father was purged. What lessons does he take away from in terms of how he sees the Chinese system? I don't know. I think for the younger generation, I mean, people, 20s and 30s, grown up, come to adulthood since '89, it must just be, like the ancient history for a lot of them. But, it sort of pops up in odd ways, and it's still not, completely openly or honestly dealt with. So it's still sort of festering there, and comes up in various sensitive episodes and moments.
Edith, please.
Hi, Mike. As a journalist and writer, you've had a unique opportunity to study and look at North Korea at a time when the parallels are just all too strong with China in the 1970s. My question is, between 1976 and 1979, attitudes in the U.S. towards China turned around 180 degrees. Maybe that's the next sequence of your series. But how did, I'm just very struck at how that could have happened, and whether, when you look at North Korea, which is equally, if not more, closed today, whether the media or politicians working on the issue could achieve a similar degree of turnaround.
The answer to the first part of your question is the next episode, which I've shown here, but for those of you who missed it, it's available online, does look at the sort of the opening up and this astonishing sea change in which the Chinese go from being, you know, the yellow peril to the cuddly communists. It's an amazing phenomenon. I don't really see it happening with North Korea. You know, the circumstances are totally different. The country is much less important and less, you know, it's only important. I mean, to be honest, if North Korea didn't have nuclear weapons, it would be Rwanda, or that's an insult to Rwanda, but you know, it would be some obscure country that the Americans never cared about. It's really, from the American point of view, it's just a sort of security concern. There was a moment when Bill Clinton was president where, had the history unfolded differently, you might have had a Nixon to Beijing episode, because Kim Jong-il invited Clinton in the fall of 2000. Clinton sent Madeleine Albright to lay the groundwork. He was ready to go. And then there was the disputed presidential election, which delayed the outcome for 6 weeks, and then Bush won. Had Gore won that election cleanly that night, I'm convinced Bill Clinton would have gone to Pyongyang before he left office, and the whole history of the last dozen years would be completely different. But it didn't happen. I don't see it happening.
Although Rwanda doesn't have conventional artillery that can level an OECD country's capital.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah. I mean, as I said, not fair to Rwanda, but the point is the Americans, I mean, most
Korea would be a
Americans,
terrible threat
Don't-
even without nuclear
don't-
weapons,
yeah.
no?
but I mean, you know, the lesson to small countries that have contentious relationships with the United States from North Korea is get nukes fast.
Over here, please.
Hi, so I've got two questions for you. The first one is, what do you think are the major impacts and influences of Cultural Revolution in China? I mean, speaking of long term, and from either a positive perspective or negative side. So the second question is that, do you think the Cultural Revolution is a necessary step for China to make some like democratic reform?
I think the Cultural Revolution was a total unnecessary, self-inflicted disaster. No positive side to it whatsoever. In terms of the impact, I think, I mean, there's a whole, as I said, there's a whole generation today, you know, in their 40s and 50s who lived through that. It's very, very hard to generalize. I mean, one of the impacts of the Cultural Revolution is that, you know, millions of people in the society lived through this experience where one side was denouncing the other side, people were responsible for imprisoning, torturing, killing other people that in their community, their workspace, and nobody talks about it. I mean, you hear these stories of people in the same work unit walking, somebody walks down the street past the person who led the group of Red Guards who beat their father to death and stuff like that. So there's this huge internally that people don't express anything. And I don't think that's healthy. I mean, I think it's very hard to come to terms with something that was as cataclysmic as the Cultural Revolution if you can't deal openly about it. And I mean, it was, you know, it was a massive destruction of Chinese cultural heritage. You know, the suffering inflicted on people who had, you know, Western learning or outside contact with the outside world. Was enormous. So you know, there's a very negative legacy which hasn't been fully or openly or honestly addressed, but it's kind of been shunted aside because everybody's looking forward and it's inconvenient and problematic to think about it, so people only in their quietest moments with their closest friends do. Otherwise, it's all looking forward, but I think there's a price to be paid for not coming to terms honestly with something like the Cultural Revolution or the Great Leap Forward. But what it is in what way, hard to say.
Back here, we've got a lot of questions. We'll try to work through. Yes, please.
I'm curious, you touched on the issue of this idea that there's really no collective memory in China. The younger generation really has no idea what Tiananmen was all about. Yet, I follow the foreign ministry briefings, and I'm always struck when I hear them talking about Japan, how Japan has this need to come to terms with history and face up to its role in history, constantly harping on the importance of history at the same time, denying history in its own country. Is that just real politics? Is that just pure politics? Is it just Machiavellian politics? Or is there some justification for that disconnect in the Chinese psyche that I just don't recognize?
Well, I think there's some justification for the Chinese being extremely irritated by particularly what Abe has done and his myopia in being honest about World War II. But I also think that the Chinese could make a conscious decision not to respond in the way they do. I read a very interesting, I remember I read it, observation that somebody made that in Asian cultures that one of the ways you end up apologizing to somebody is you don't just go down and apologize. It's like you take them out to a very expensive meal and you make sure you get the check and you give them gifts and it's understood you're saying we're sorry. And Japan sort of did that, with all this aid and investment and so on. But I think also, so there are sort of geopolitical reasons as well. But I'm surprised that Abe hasn't turned around and said, this is pot calling the kettle black here. Because it is. I mean, the irony of Chinese officials saying Japanese have to be honest about their history when the Chinese aren't honest about their history is very striking. There's no question about that.
Back here and then over here, please. Back in the corner there, please.
Mike, fantastic. As a sinologist, having been in China for 34 years, I really appreciate all your insights and taking everything into consideration. I just wonder if you think that the current president is making himself out to be the new Mao. Is he gathering his troops, slaughtering his enemies, which we do see happening? There are many questions I have, but I think this is the big question for you.
Is Xi a new Mao? My gut feeling is not really. And I mean, I think, I remember having a conversation with somebody in the middle of 2012, looking at all of the problems that China had, and somebody made the observation that the top leadership knows what the problems are, and they have a pretty good idea of what they have to do to fix them. But the leadership structure that was bequeathed by Deng Xiaoping of this kind of collective leadership and rule by committee and first among equals and the lessening of central power meant that one of the big challenges for the Chinese leadership was if they were ever going to introduce any of the economic reforms that they need over time, how can they do it when the regions don't listen to the center, when there's not a strong person? So to some degree, there may be a consensus at the very top to allow Xi Jinping to become this more powerful person, because without that, they have no chance of ramming these painful, controversial steps through. So that's, running China is, I wouldn't want to be Xi Jinping or any of the, it's a nightmare. So it's not that surprising. The debate is how much of this tightening and anti-corruption and repression is qualitatively new and is going to become the new normal as Xi builds himself up. How much of it is, as one cynic describes, signaling left to turn right. That if you're going to make these changes, you want to control, monopolize information, you want to suppress discordant voices, you want to muzzle enemies. The jury's out. I think there are lots of things to be concerned about, but I think you can see from their perspective why there's a certain logic in allowing this person to emerge in this way. But it also carries risks that gets carried away. I mean, and in a situation where he's arrogated so much power to himself, you know, who's there who will go and say, oh, Mr. President, this is wrong, we should be doing this differently? Is he getting alternative voices? Is it just living in this bubble where his way is the only way? I don't know, but I think it's much more complicated. And while he gets lots of press and it's all, you know, the Central Committee under Xi Jinping and so on, I mean, I don't see it as Mao. At least, you know, you could be laughing at me in 3 years, but I don't right now anyway.
Up here, please. Up here, a second in this row, please.
As somebody who's spent most of their life in Hong Kong, grown up here, remembers watching what was happening in Tiananmen on TV here, I've always been quite fascinated by the relationship between the Hong Kong people and that of their mainland brethren, especially in light of what seems to be happening at the moment. And I just wonder what it was like when you were stationed here in the 70s, what the sentiment was for the local Hong Kong Chinese to what was happening. Were they getting much information themselves here, or was it still fairly independent ideologically to what was happening?
Well, I would say sort of two elements to that. One was China was really very far away. I don't think on a day-to-day basis there was very little back and forth. The idea that Hong Kong might be handed back to China was a, you know, figment of somebody's imagination. So in one way, it really seemed far, far, far away. I think for local Hong Kong Chinese who had, you know, relatives there, there was some, there were letters, there was some travel, and actually that was one of the sources that journalists used. If you knew somebody who had a relative, they would get letters or they would come back and forth. That was one of the ways you could sort of get one of the pieces of a very big jigsaw puzzle. But China really was sort of, you know, it was also, you know, we knew it was like out there, looming out there, but it, you know, it was this, almost this, you know, I mean, I remember going out to Lok Ma Chau or someplace and standing on the hill and peering over, or you know, across from Shenzhen, peering over at the rice paddies and wondering what was, because you just couldn't get there. It was, and it wasn't, I mean, it really wasn't until the British began negotiating with the Chinese in 78, 79 on MacLehose that some consciousness that it might be different. It really wasn't front and center.
With that, thank you very much. I guess
one more
we got one more over there.
If it's short.
Coming back, a second question.
It's
Okay,
very
last question, just a short question.
This is a very short question. What does the China dream mean to you? Because there's all the talk about China
short
dream,
answer,
中国梦.
Yeah. There's a 50-50 chance it could go either way. That's I have no idea. It's very hard to say. It's very hard to say, and it's certainly not in a short answer.
You probably have no shortage of practically everything from the front desk here,
Right.
but here's another one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. Let me remind you that there are DVDs here for those of you who might want to show this to your friends. And for those of you who haven't signed up for our events yet, again, we have Senior Economic Planner of the top economic planner of Guangdong coming here next week to talk about the economy, and also Hong Kong's legal system. Is it any better than the mainland's? Thank you all. Bye-bye.